Please be seated. The court is now back in session. We will now give the floor to Nuon Chea to make his statements related to the facts of the evacuation of people from Phnom Penh on the 17th April 1975 and from certain other towns. Mr. Nuon Chea, you may now proceed. Nuon Chea, thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, journalists, and good morning, my Cambodian compatriots. I am delighted that I am given the opportunity to enlighten the court to my Cambodian people inside the country and overseas regarding the evacuation of people from Phnom Penh city after the liberation day of 17 April 1975. Through my recollection, the opinion of the Standing Committee of Democratic Cambodia at the time, or we can say bluntly of the Communist Party of Cambodia, made the following decisions. Upon the liberation of Phnom Penh, we have to evacuate the people from Phnom Penh or not. It's because, one, if our soldiers come to control the city, will the Americans bomb the city? And we cannot actually predict the behavior of the Americans as they used to bomb the countryside for 330 days in order to smash the resistant movement and to destroy our economy. Two, if the Americans bombed the city, will the Vietnamese just stand idle? No, in fact, the Vietnamese would pretend to come to lend their support to Democratic Cambodia. And by that means, they would mobilize their soldiers under the pretext of assisting Cambodia, but instead to control us, to invade us. And for these two main reasons, that would lead to the evacuation. And for that reason, the Standing Committee actually invited chairmen of all zones to inform them of the imminent evacuation of Phnom Penh residents upon the liberation, and inquired which zone could actually accommodate a number of certain people from Phnom Penh. And through my recollection, for those zones which could produce a lot of agricultural products would accommodate more, and that would be the North Zone. So we consulted with the chairman of the North Zone, and the chairman of the North Zone decided to accommodate 1.5 million people, and the rest of the remaining residents of Phnom Penh, that is another 0.5, would be distributed to various other zones. For example, to the east, or to the other zones, and they also confirmed that the people at the base shall behave properly toward the evacuees, that is the new people, and in particular to lend their spiritual support as brothers and sisters, as a one nation of Cambodia, and that they should not discriminate the newcomers. And the zone chairman participate in the meeting, and they also relate the instructions to all those cooperatives. So it is not that the Democratic Cambodia decided to evacuate Phnom Penh without taking any responsibility. In fact, they took responsibility and they decided that matter in a formal meeting. Unfortunately, as we saw it, upon the liberation, and it is apparent that we had to evacuate the people, as we were afraid the Americans would bomb the city as they used to do it. They used to bomb for more than 200 to 300 tons. And you could see the remnants of the bombs as big as a large pond. And we did have conflicts with the neighboring countries, and of course I could point out that would be Vietnam. And Pol Pot actually spoke in the meeting that Vietnam was our friend, but they were of the adversary nature. They could pretend to lend their support to Cambodia, but in fact they would strengthen their authority via their soldiers upon their entry into Cambodia. And that is a very complicated issue, and this is for all the national compatriots to understand. It is not just we do everything and we took it for granted. If people in Phnom Penh, and based on the means of food support, it would be a difficult choice to consider. Based on the information that we could get, there would be issues with the fuel provision and with the food supply to Phnom Penh residents. And if we let them remain in Phnom Penh, then they would face the challenge of the lack of food. And if the food could be provided in limited amount, it would mean the food would not go to the poorest group. It would go to the ones who could afford it, who could purchase the food. And that's another main reasons of the issues of the lack of food supply and transportation. I would also like to reiterate that each zone was instructed to give instruction to the cooperatives to have good, positive attitude toward the evacuees, because they could not engage in hard labor as the best people did, and they had to be friendly to one another. But in practice, certain areas could do it, but other areas lacked in substance, despite the repeated instructions given to them. And of course, we had those groups who created havoc within the group. I, at the time, was a member of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of Cambodia, and I actually recall these very true main points. And the first one, as I said, whether the Americans would bomb the city, and the second one is the food supply and transportation to the people in the city. And upon seeing such difficulties and challenges, we had to resolve the situation based on what we had. And for that reason, we decided to evacuate the people to resettle at the cooperatives in order to minimize the difficulties they faced in the city. And we did that out of the kindness of the generosity and not for the fact that we would land them in difficult situations. And this is my frank statement from the bottom of my heart as someone who was responsible for what happened at the time. President, thank you, Mr. Nuon Chea. I would like now to give the floor to Nuon Chea's defense to put the questions to the witness, Mr. Sidney Schanberg. You may proceed.
Good evening, Mr. Schanberg. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It's clear.
Just the first question before I go to the content of my questions. Were you able to listen to what Nuon Chea just stated?
Yes, I heard his remarks, or the translation of his remarks.
Then you have heard him speak about a few subjects in relation to the events in April 75 that I would also like to ask you questions about. The topics that I would like to cover at least today would be the question of U.S. bombing, the questions of food shortage, situations in the refugee camps, and possibly also a possible threat of Vietnam. But before I go to these questions, I would briefly like to ask you a few introductory questions, if that is all right with you. Firstly, I just noticed this morning that you were asking somebody in the room with you to help you memorize the first name of Bizot. I was just wondering, so that we know, who is present with you in the video room?
My wife and a UN official who helped set up this system so that I could testify from New York instead of flying all the way to Cambodia.
Okay, thank you very much. Another introductory question would be where you were stationed in the period between 1970 and 1975. You were, as I understand, covering the events in Southeast Asia. What was your position? Where were you stationed in the period between 70 and 75?
My post, my original post, was the bureau chief in New Delhi, covering south, that section of Asia. India, Pakistan, Burma, and countries there. And I was called to Cambodia when, in 1970, when Prince Sihanouk was deposed and a new group took over the government, the Lon Nol group. And so I came in and covered that for several months. And and then went back to New Delhi to do my stories there. And then I was asked to come back to Southeast Asia when the North Vietnamese began an attack called the Easter Offensive, 1974. I'm trying to think of the year, but I may be wrong on the year. But in any case, and so I spent that year, most of that year, covering that offensive. And when it was over, I went to Cambodia again and spent a long time. And I kept going back to Cambodia is what I guess I'm trying to say, because it was a country that was not being, the war in Cambodia was not being covered very well, and I wanted to dig deeper. And so that was my situation.
So if I would summarize, you were in fact covering for the New York Times the war in Cambodia between 70 and 75. Were you also covering the events in neighboring Vietnam?
The only long period of time I spent in Vietnam was during that Easter offensive, and I traveled to all kinds of places in the north where the Vietnamese army crossed crossed into the South Vietnam. And I stayed there for a few months and so forth, and so I became very, very interested in Cambodia simply because it was a country that seemed to be not able to defend itself, and it's a country I didn't know a great deal about, and I began to learn, and I guess that's my story.
Thank you. You have been testifying earlier that you have visited Cambodia between 70 and 75 frequently. In your diary on page 111, the first or the second paragraph, that would be ERN number 008-98319. The second paragraph, it says, and I quote, "At times along this road today we see heavy war damage, with homes and pagodas flattened by the massive B-52 bombing raids of 1973. Now this is something that you've been describing in what you've been seeing in 75. Would this description correspond with the things that you have seen in terms of results of the US bombings in the period that you visited Cambodia between 70 and 75?
I saw in many places the damage caused by the bombings and reported them. There was I had no biases as to who was doing what, but both sides got covered, and certainly the American portion was covered very, very carefully and in great detail.
Could you please expand today a little bit more about the things that you have seen, the results from the US bombings in those periods between 1970 and 1973?
Well, what I saw were places where nobody lived anymore. And I had no way of going off into the countryside where the reporters, when they did venture into the countryside, were captured and killed. So, that would limit writing any stories about it. Point is that I talked to local people when I found them, and they told me what happened, and I reported it. And you can go back to go into the New York Times archives or Google it, and you will find the stories. And I was doing a lot of covering of what the Americans were doing, and they were not happy about it.
Are you able to recollect the direct effects of the U.S. bombing on the economy, on the inhabitants of Cambodia? What was the impact of those U.S. bombings?
I have no way of knowing.
Mr. President.
President, witness, please wait. The prosecutor, you may proceed.
Your Honours, I object because this is the exact type of question to which my learned friend yesterday objected when I asked it, and his objection was sustained, and so now it should stand against him as well. It should not be permitted.
I didn't object to anything. Pre-75 conditions are relevant. There's always our viewpoint. I didn't object to the questions in that respect at all. I think you are mistaken with my learned friend here on that side. I didn't object, so I have no idea what this objection is coming from.
And in fairness to my learned friend, I should be more specific. The objection is in relation to seeking conclusions or opinions from the witness, and that the nature of the evidence my learned friend was just seeking to elicit is the type of evidence that I was instructed yesterday to refrain from eliciting, and so the same standard should apply to him.
Very well, I will rephrase. Mr. Schamberg, have you seen the results of the U.S. bombing? Have you been able to see with your own eyes or to hear with your own ears what the results were, in fact, of the U.S. bombing campaign?
I have seen villages along roads that were destroyed by bombing. I had no way, unless I wanted to get killed, of going into the territory held by the Khmer Rouge, because all the evidence pointed to certain deaths because the men who did go looking in early years, early months, were killed. And so what I saw was only partial. I don't know how it affected the economy. I don't know how many people were killed. I don't know whether the bombing had a positive effect for the Khmer Rouge in convincing young men to come and fight for them. And so there's no way, I have no specific information, eventually, after the war, reporters were not allowed in either. So,
thank you, Mr. Schamberg. Let me
to continue to live a little longer. That's all.
Thank you. Let me follow up on this subject and refer you to what you have been writing, what you have written in your diary on page 7. That would be the entry of January 11th, ERN number 008988215. Directly under January 11, you write the following. Long rolls of thunder awaken me, but the skies are clear. The noise is man-made, government planes dropping CBUs, cluster bomb units. These are anti-personnel bombs, each projectile carrying thousands of little bombs that explode over a wide area and are designed to kill and maim as many people as possible. As distinct from ordinary bombs meant for destroying pinpoint targets and installations. This is the first time, you write, the Cambodian Air Force has used these American weapons extensively. And these are advanced versions of the CBU. Many of them contain napalm. Could you tell us what were your sources when you wrote this down in your diary?
Can I tell you what? I didn't hear the rest of the question.
What were your sources for this information in your diary?
My sources were sources both in Cambodia and in the United States, military sources that I have, and they were confidential sources. And that's where my information came from.
Following up on a question asked by the civil parties about involvement of American military advisors. On page 8, the very bottom of the page, the entry January 14, ERN number 008-98216, you write the following. With head bowed, he tells me that an American colonel in charge of U.S. arms deliveries ordered him off the airport, citing security reasons. Washington contends it has no advisors here and that the Cambodians are running their own war. Yet, an American colonel orders Cambodians off a Cambodian airport. The Americans are king here now, Pran says dejectedly. Is that something that you have observed yourself as well?
Yes, I observed it that day, and I protested it, and we went on doing our jobs, writing what was going on in Cambodia.
But what would you be able to tell about the actual involvement of military advisors in respect of the war that was fought by the Lon Nol regime against the insurgents?
I don't know what your question is. Are you saying how could I find out about American...
Well, my question would be is what do you know about the active military involvement in the fighting of the Lon Nol military against the insurgents?
All I really do know is that the military office in the American embassy sent men to discuss ways, to fight more successfully, discuss with the Cambodian government. And I had gotten no information about any soldier or officer, American, that went into combat with the troops and guide them on the spot. This was just discussions of ways to fight the war, as far as I could tell. And there were no American units that were ever sent in except in 1970, and that I wrote about. I don't know what point you're trying to make.
Later in your diary, Mr. Jambuk, page 43, just above the entry of April 12, and that would be ERN number 00898-251, you write, later at the American embassy, I have a normal conversation with the military attaché. He says the overall situation is hopeless, but does find out one bright spot. a brief battle that took place north of the city today. We killed 22 on the ground, he says, grinning, and that's pretty nice. Do you recall, Mr. Schamberg, this conversation with this military attaché?
Yes, that's why it's in the diary.
What else do you remember about this conversation?
Only that. That was what, to me, leaped out of it. You know, because that is how people. That is how people talk when they're at war or involved in a war in any way. That's what wars are like. That's what I was writing about. And who gets hurt and who doesn't.
And well, my question to you, and that is the point that I'm getting at, I suppose, is what are you able to tell us about the active military involvement by the U.S. government in the war being fought against the insurgents?
All that I know is that the Americans used men and equipment to guide the bombing. The bombers came from Cambodia, and they came from Guam, from Thailand, and they came from Guam, and the Americans taught the Cambodian army people how to guide these planes and make sure they were on the right path. And at one point, it was discovered that they were doing this from the American embassy, which was a violation of a law that had been passed by the American Congress, and they had to move out of the embassy and help and do the work at a Cambodian military building, so it wasn't being done inside the embassy. So they were trying to help. Obviously, but they were not in any way that I know about how the definition of a war, and in any direct way they were not involved in the war. The bombing was the involvement.
What do you remember about the constant possibility of U.S. military aid being stepped up in the period 74 and 75?
Well, it was known that the American Congress was felt very urgently about closing down our role in the American role in Cambodia. And they decided they were not, first of all, they decided that the bombing had to stop, and that was in, I believe, July 15th or 18th in 1973. So the bombing stopped. And later on, the Congress refused to add any more aid as the Khmer Rouge grew closer and closer to seizing the capital. And so no new aid was supplied. And we wrote about that. Again, as you say, who got hurt and who... wars are not, how should I put it? Wars are not, how should I say, sane occupations. They're insane. They're bestial. And so, and I've covered several of them. And this was one of them. And so what I wrote was what I saw and learned. And that's what I put into my my stories.
Do you remember, Mr. Schamberg, speaking in 1973 or 74, 75, if at all, to sources about a possible resuming again of
I think I know of no renewed discussion of turning the bombing on again. I know of none. There may have been discussions, but it would take place in Washington. And I didn't find out, nobody at the American Embassy in Cambodia mentioned that or in my discussions with them. And so, no, I know nothing about that.
Yet, or maybe not yet, but in your diary on April 5, that will be page 36, in the fourth paragraph, ERN number 00898244, you write down, a rumor spreads through some military units that the Americans are going to save the government in a few days by resuming their massive bombing with B-52s. Now, where would you write that down if you didn't think it was a possibility?
Because I take it that you haven't actually been in a war, because during wars lots of rumors crop up, and that's all it was. It's just that people are looking for some ray of hope that the war will end, so the rumor spreads, and that's all it was a rumor. And that's what I was doing. I wrote these words there because I'm telling you what the atmosphere was in the city and in the country. That's all.
Are you able to tell, or do you recall if people were in fact taking this rumor seriously at the time?
I have no way of knowing. I didn't do I didn't run around doing asking people did they believe the rumor or not. It's a rumor, and that's why it's called a rumor and not a fact.
Let me rephrase let me ask it differently. Do you remember where the rumor came from?
No. All it was, in other words, it started somewhere, but by the time it got to me, it was at least a few hours old. I don't know where it started.
Did you ever speak to people at the time who were convinced that U.S. bombing could resume any moment?
No. The truth of the matter is, Counselor, that the only thing I knew about what was being planned in the embassy was that the ambassador, John Gunther Dean, was trying to convince Washington, that means Nixon and Kissinger, to consider negotiations with the Khmer Rouge. And I wrote about that. And he was rebuffed again and again with the argument that unless you're winning the war, there are going to be no negotiations because the Khmer Rouge have no reason to negotiate if they're winning. And John Gunther Dean, the ambassador, thought it was still worth trying to contact the Khmer Rouge leaders, and he was rebuffed again and again, and that's part of the history, and I wrote about
it. Speaking about Ambassador Dean, Mr. Chamber, on page 10 of your diary, the entry January 29, you write that would be ERN number 008922118. In the fourth paragraph from below, you write the following. Asked what the Americans know about the Khmer Rouge leadership and who they might negotiate with, Mr. Dean says, and I quote, "We know little, very damn little about the Khmer Rouge." Do you remember him saying that to you?
Yes.
Do you remember him expanding on this? Did he say more?
He did not.
Earlier, on a question, you have testified that you, in that period, had not been speaking to any Khmer Rouge cadre, be it high up, high ranking or low ranking. Would that be correct?
They weren't around.
Would it be fair to say, on the basis of your recollection, that you also knew little, very damn little, about the Khmer Rouge?
Yes, we didn't know everything that they were doing, and there were no reporters were allowed to go into those areas, or no reporters ventured in those areas because those who did got killed. And so, no, we didn't know a lot, except what we called the Bush Telegraph, meaning the stories kept coming in about people being attacked and killed and frightened and forced into the war by the Khmer Rouge, that they were rough and worse.
Would it be possible for you, in your recollection and going through the experience and the answering of the questions, to say something about the perception of the Khmer Rouge at the period 70-75, more specifically 1975, about potential U.S. bombing? I know I'm a slippery slope here, so I'm not asking you to speculate, but just based on your experience and knowledge, and your conversations with everybody involved, whether it would be possible that the Khmer Rouge were actually fearing that the U.S. would resume their bombing once Phnom Penh would be liberated.
The President, Mr. Schenberg, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed.
We object to this question, and my friend was right to be reluctant. He's inviting the witness to enter the minds of the Khmer Rouge and speculate as to what they were thinking. It is an improper question and should not be allowed.
As you have heard, Mr. President, I've tried to refrain the questions as much as I could. Although I am the first one to admit that this witness is not an expert, I think it's still within the realms of the cross-examination to ask him on the basis of all the conversations that he's had and all the observations that he has made, whether he would still think it is feasible that the leaders of the Khmer Rouge were thinking that U.S. bombing of Phnom Penh was likely.
Do they want me to answer?
Need to rule on the objection.
Yeah.
The President. The objection and the ground of objection by the prosecutor against the last question posed by the defense counsel is sustained, and the counsel is directed not to put such question to the witness, and we believe that the defense counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia understand the nature of the question very well. You should not ask any questions that elicit his personal conclusion of the event. Therefore, the witness is instructed not to respond to the last question posed by International Counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia, And Council, you may now move on.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will move on to a second subject. And that is a subject that was also mentioned briefly by the brief statement that Nguyen Chia was giving earlier this morning. And that was the question of food supply in Phnom Penh in 1975. There are quite some entries, Mr. Schamberg, in your diary where you speak about the food shortage, malnutrition, the increasing hunger. If just for the record I could lead you through your diary and point at those quotations of you. For instance, on page 10 of your diary, that would be the last paragraph, January 30, ERN number 008988218. You were speaking about the last supply ships with food, fuel, and ammunition are coming in. One page further, on top of page 11, you are saying, or you're writing, the rice rationing has begun. On page 14 of your diary, on the very top of the page, you write, I visit an overcrowded Western relief clinic. The malnutrition problem is starkly visible here. Dying children are on every treatment table. A little further, on that same page, entry of your diary is February 13, you write, prices are moving farther out of reach of average Cambodians. Hunger is increasing. On page 16, entry of the diary, February 23, ERN number 008982224, you write in the second paragraph from below, despite the underground living, casualties remain heavy and this food situation is even graver than it was a month ago. Every child one sees is suffering from some form of malnutrition. And the situation seems to get worse when we progress in time, because on page 27, entry of your diary, March 14, ERN number 008988235. In the paragraph, the third paragraph of March 14, you write, and I quote, the international relief agencies hold a meeting on the severe malnutrition problem. One page further, page 28, you talk about street dogs, March 16 in the middle of that same page. There used to be an army of stray dogs on the streets. Some streets had so many you had to drive slowly to avoid them. Now there are hardly any. The reason is hunger. Before the war it was unheard of. Only Vietnamese ate dogs. Now dog meat is in all the market. I just have three more quotes to put to you. That would be page 32 at the very bottom. That would, the entry is March 24. You write, at the malnutrition clinic, about 1,500 mothers press forward, holding out starving infants and appealing to Western doctors to allow them in for treatment. One page further, page 33, same date, you write in the third paragraph, food is getting shorter. The government reduces the rice ratio again. And finally, Mr. Schamberg, on March 27, on page 34, you write in the middle of that page, north of Phnom Penh, further negative news. Wounded soldier evacuees from the surrounded garrison at Long Vec report food so short that the troops are eating banana stalks and the trunks of papaya trees. We were eating the same food as pigs, said one wounded evacuee. In that same paragraph, to conclude, the soldiers say that some friendly insurgent troops had been offering them rice and urging them to retreat and lay down their arms. Mr. Shambuk, if these excerpts from your diary are coming to your mind again, would you be able to expand also today on the effects of the food shortage and the malnutrition? What were you able to see and experience in those months in 1975?
Well, first of all, the reason that the rations, rice and other food and also munitions, the reason that those materials were not getting into Phnom Penh was that the Khmer Rouge had been successful in cutting off all the entries into the capital, whether on land or from the river, the Mekong. And so it was an obvious thing. There were nothing coming in. They weren't getting any. Food wasn't being dropped by airplanes at that point. And that was the reason. So I don't understand. Is there any question in your mind about why there was not enough food? The city had grown from 1 million to 2 million. The extra million were people who fled into Phnom Penh. And there wasn't enough food for them.
But could there be other reasons? For instance, the fact that there were so many refugees, that people were starving?
Why there were so many refugees? Well, what were they running from? I mean, what can I say? They told us they were running because the Khmer Rouge army was closing in, seizing their towns, and they wanted to save themselves, and they wanted to feed their children. I mean, that's what wars are. They're not tea parties, and so it's that's what if you go back and look at histories of wars, you will see that that's one of the things that armies do. Cut off food supply and ammunition supply to an enemy.
Are you saying? I interrupt you, Mr. Shambuk. Are you saying that before the supply lines were cut off, there was no malnutrition or food shortage or hunger in Phnom Penh?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. You can go find doctors who tell you that. The fact is, there was enough rice before the Khmer Rouge began to chew up and occupy large segments of the country. And that's something you could find anywhere. I mean, it's a fact.
Did you
more than 80% of the land in the country?
Did you also speak, Mr. Shambuk, to refugees who had fled to Phnom Penh because of the U.S. bombings or the napalm bombings of the Cambodian Air Force?
Well, I can tell you that I interviewed lots of refugees, and they did not talk about the bombings as something that drove them out of their houses. And that may be an omission on their part, but that's not what they talked about. They talked about the Khmer Rouge.
Could it be also an admission on your part that you were not speaking to the right people, or that you were not speaking to refugees who had in fact been fleeing the U.S. bombings?
How would I know if I walked into a refugee camp which ones would talk to me and which wouldn't?
Then why are you making this? Then why are you making the statement that they were all fleeing for the occupation by the insurgents? Maybe you should have been speaking to more refugees. Would that be fair to say?
Well, that's an interesting suggestion, but it's laughable. That's what because it's laughable because and people were fleeing from them.
So is your testimony that nobody was fleeing from the effects of the U.S. bombing?
Well, when somebody bombs you, yeah, you have to get out of your house or somebody's going to get killed. But that is not what they talked about.
That's not what the people that you were speaking to talked about. But have you heard any other stories from people about refugees fleeing from the U.S. bombing?
That it was the bombs they were running from?
Yes.
Yes? Where did you read that?
Well, there's abundant evidence, Mr. Schamberg, but apparently not privy for you.
The President, Mr. Witness, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor is on his feet. You may proceed, Prosecutor.
Your Honours, I think we've all observed counsel speaking over the top of the video feed from New York with Mr. Schamberg trying to answer his questions. Could counsel be invited to wait for the answers to come through and then formulate his questions so that we can all understand what the questions are and what the answers are?
I don't know if that's an objection, Mr. President, but I will try to observe that. However, sometimes it is actually the witness who is interrupting me. But never mind. My question still to sum up this subject, Mr. Schamberg, would be: have you heard from any source about refugees fleeing the devastating effects of the U.S. bombing and refugees who went to Phnom Penh?
There may have been such refugees, but that's where they headed for safety. And if you have evidence that the bombings were the reason, then you should bring it up and show us the evidence. Because I was on the scene. I'm a professional journalist. I had no reason to write these things, and I had no reason to make remarks that were favorable to the successes of the Khmer Rouge. Whatever I found out, I put in my stories. So, and it's not pleasant to be told that you have evidence, but you can't show it to us. That's not the way to get at the truth.
But while we're on this subject, I wanted to leave that for tomorrow. But now we're on the subject. There is quite some critique on your reporting, and in the sense that you were presenting too much an American view. Other people might call it imperialist view, but that you were really portraying the American view on the events that happened in Cambodia at that time.
You go back and do some more research. You will find that the embassy was sending
President, Mr. Witness, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed. Counsel, Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed.
Go ahead.
I do have to object, Your Honours. I think my learned friend is being entirely unfair to the witness. If he wishes to accuse him of being less than objective, or if he wishes to point to specific criticism of his work, then that, as the witness himself has just been suggesting, then that information should be put to him and he should be asked to comment. To make these broad assertions whereby counsel are effectively testifying before Your Honours is not appropriate, and it doesn't help the witness and it doesn't help Your Honours.
Mr. President, we can all observe that we have a witness here who is not afraid to say the things that he wants to say. He doesn't really need any protection from the prosecution. So, but I will rephrase it in a more neutral way, Mr. President. Are you aware, Mr. Schamberg, of critique on the content of your reporting?
You have to be more specific. What critique?
That the critique was on your reporting, that your reporting was too one-sided, too much favoring the American position in Cambodia, too much ignoring the viewpoints of the Khmer Rouge?
Again, Your Honours,
The President, witness is instructed not to respond to the question of this kind because the nature of the question falls far beyond the scope of the hearing, and the question of this kind makes the witness lose his confidence in responding to the question. So the chamber rules that the witness need not respond to this question, and counsel is directed to prepare your questions in accordance with the guidelines introduced to parties, and they should refrain from putting any questions that is not allowed in the course of the hearing we have had thus far.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not quite sure if I understand it correctly. We have a witness here who has been adjourned.
The President, please hold on. Judges need to discuss this. The President, I hand over the floor to Judge Civil Cartwright to direct the counsel in relation to the question put to the witness. Judge, you may proceed.
Yes, thank you, President. As an addendum to the President's ruling, counsel for Nguyen Chia is entitled to challenge this witness as to the balance of his reporting, as to its accuracy, but he cannot put blanket challenges such as, there have been critiques, what do you have to say to that? They must be specific, and the witness himself has asked for those details. So, Mr. Korpi, if you intend to pursue this line of questioning, please be specific.
Thank you, Judge Cartwright. I completely agree with you. Actually, it was a topic that I wanted to discuss tomorrow and in more detail, and actually mention the critique. But I suppose I got carried away after the answers of the witness. I will move on, Mr. Schamberg, to April 17, and the things that you have observed on that day. On page 91 of your diary, you write the following, and that would be in the middle of that page, ERN number 00898299. It says, Becker further reports that the town is a shambles, empty and looted, and that there have been a lot of fires. He personally has seen no fighting between different Khmer Rouge factions, but some Cambodians told him that there had been some feuding over the demarcation of sectors in the city. Do you remember having this conversation? Would you be able to expand on this conversation? What did he mean when he was writing the demarcation of sectors in the city?
To tell you the truth, I would have to go back into notebooks to see what that meant. But this is what he told me, and maybe you would have to go to him to ask him what he meant. But I don't have my notebook with me, so I can't answer that question.
Do you recall other sources speaking about different behavior of different insurgent troops coming from entering Phnom Penh in different parts?
Well, I saw that when the army came in to Phnom Penh, the army of Mr. Nguyen Che, there were young people who looked like, let's say, green new soldiers, and there were a lot of other soldiers who looked very, very, let's say, very trained, very looking like, let's say, seasoned soldiers. So there may have been, different groups. But that doesn't surprise me.
To be more specific, Mr. Schamberg, have you heard people talking about, for instance, variation in discipline between troops entering from the east or troops entering from the south? Stories to that effect?
The only story to that effect that I know of is the time during the war when the communist side moved people from the eastern Cambodia near the Vietnam border and moved them into the western side, closer to the Thai border. And the complaint apparently was, but this is something that was simply not explained in detail, that they were getting too friendly with the Vietnamese. And Hun Sen, who now is the Prime Minister of Cambodia, was one of the complainants, apparently, about the rules and punishments of the Khmer Rouge in that area. His own people were hurting the cause by being cruel.
When you were writing down your notes in your diary, Mr. Schambek, around the period of 17 April or before or shortly after, did you know any names of Khmer Rouge commanders who were leading the insurgent forces into Phnom Penh?
No, I didn't know the name of the generals who led the final push, who led the final push. No, I didn't know who they were.
Do you know if, or do you remember if U.S. military officials or attaché or members of the U.S. embassy were speaking about names of the commanders of the forces that were entering Phnom Penh?
I never had, no. I never had conversations with any in the military office about who was leading the group.
When you were at the French embassy, did you hear stories about variation in possible casualties or possible incidents of looting varying in different parts of Phnom Penh? For instance, there might be more looting incidents or other incidents going on in the Mekong area or in the south of Phnom Penh or at the airport. Have you heard variation in those stories?
No, I didn't hear any stories that they were doing it. Somebody was looting in one area but not in another. I didn't hear any breakdown of that. I just know that there was looting, and the evidence was clear because we drove through the city when our convoy left the embassy, and we saw the shops having been looted. Not only that, the first day when we were released by the Khmer Rouge, our Khmer Rouge captors, we walked out of the place where we had been held and into the street, and they returned some of our belongings that they had taken. And others came up and pushed bottles of soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, orangeade, and so forth. And we thought they were making a friendly gesture, and then they would pull it away and laugh. And that's, there's nothing civil about a war. And I don't have any expertise to, and maybe you'll tell us more about this, about different sections of that army who were doing good things.
But would it be fair to finish this topic that the things that you have seen in Phnom Penh those days are either the events on 17 April when you were still outside, or after your evacuation to Thailand, and the things that you saw alongside the road? Those are the things that you've actually been able to see with your own eyes?
Right. And I didn't see anything negative. Yes, in the beginning we saw bodies by the side of the road, and that must have happened on the last push. These were Cambodian soldiers, and there were also civilians, bodies by the roadsides. But the convoy people treated us well. They stopped and had food made for us. The one said bad words or shouted or screamed or did anything like that. And the trip was about 3 days, a little more than 3 days, and I saw these were colonies that had been built by the Khmer Rouge, and roads that had been dirt roads that had been made by the Khmer Rouge that were not on anybody's map. So it was a whole new. Their camps were not on anybody's map, as I said. And so nobody did anything. Nobody did anything bad to us. And in fact, the people who got some people who got mad at the press called us Nazis because being American, we caused in their mind we caused the war.
The President, thank you, Counsel, and thank you, Mr. Witness. The time is now appropriate for the lunch adjournment. The Chamber will adjourn now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. This afternoon, the Chamber will hear the testimony of an expert. TCE 12, and he will be questioned by the prosecutor, followed by the two defense teams. And as for the testimony of witness Sidney Schanberg is adjourned now and will resume tomorrow morning starting from 8:30 in the morning Cambodian time. Mr. Schanberg, your testimony is now adjourned, and we will resume hearing your testimony tomorrow morning starting from 8:30. So we would like to invite you once again to come to testify tomorrow morning at 8:30 Cambodian time. Mr. Schanberg, is that clear for you?
Yes, it's clear and it's fine. We'll be there. We'll be here.
Thank you, Mr. Schanberg, and goodbye for now. Security guards are instructed to bring Mr. Kil Sampon to the holding cell downstairs and have him return to this courtroom before 1:30 in the afternoon. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោយឈរ